The year is 1794. Paris, the dazzling heart of a new republic, trembles under the shadow of the guillotine. Blood stains the cobblestones, not just from tyrants, but from poets, scientists, and revolutionaries themselves. At the center of this maelstrom, a man of slight stature and impeccable dress wields absolute power. He speaks of virtue, of liberty, of a perfect republic, even as the blade falls hundreds of times a day. His name is Maximilien Robespierre, history's most profound paradox, the champion of human rights who became the architect of a terror that consumed France. How does a devoted idealist, a lawyer who once argued against the death penalty, become the ruthless enforcer of mass executions? What happens when a pursuit of ultimate purity collides with the messy reality of revolution? And how did the very ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity mutate into a justification for sacrificing thousands to the cold, impersonal logic of the state? To understand Robespierre, we must first immerse ourselves in the tumultuous crucible that was the French Revolution. This period, born of Enlightenment ideals, promised a radical new dawn for humanity, but quickly spiraled into a maelstrom of political infighting, foreign wars, and existential dread. It was a time when reason battled chaos, when the very foundations of society were torn down and rebuilt, often in blood-soaked haste. From the storming of the Bastille to the execution of kings, France was a nation intoxicated by change, yet terrified by its own momentum. It was into this volatile world that Maximilien Robespierre, the incorruptible, rose to prominence. Initially, a beacon of democratic principles, he argued for universal suffrage, freedom of the press, and the abolition of slavery. He was the voice of the people, respected for his unwavering moral compass and austere lifestyle. But as external threats mounted and internal divisions deepened, Robespierre's vision of a virtuous republic began to demand ever greater sacrifices. The pursuit of utopia morphed into a campaign of ideological purification, where dissent was treason and mercy, weakness. In this video, we will embark on a chilling journey through Robespierre's life, from his humble beginnings in Arras, to his meteoric rise as the dominant figure of the Jacobin Club and the Committee of Public Safety. We will dissect the complex, often contradictory, ideology that fueled his actions, and examine the systematic dismantling of civil liberties under the chilling banner of the Reign of Terror. Finally, we will witness his dramatic and bloody downfall, a revolution devouring its own, leaving behind a legacy that continues to provoke fierce debate. Prepare to confront the unsettling questions posed by one of history's most enigmatic and controversial figures, a man who believed he was saving the revolution, even as he was destroying its soul. Before the guillotine became the grim symbol of his power, before his name was whispered with a mix of awe and dread across France, there was just Maximilien Robespierre. A quiet, intense young man from a provincial town, whose early life offered few clues to the cataclysm he would unleash. How did a shy, bookish lawyer, a champion of the poor, transform into the unyielding, incorruptible, the architect of a terror that consumed thousands, including himself? To understand the monster, or perhaps the misguided idealist, we must first return to the man. Born in 1758 in the quiet northern French city of Arras, his early life was anything but quiet in its emotional turmoil. His family, though respectable and middle class, was fractured by tragedy. When Maximilien was just 6 years old, his mother, Jacqueline, died giving birth to her 5th child. The shock was profound, shattering the already fragile equilibrium of their home. Within a year, his father, François, a lawyer himself, abandoned his children. He vanished from their lives, leaving them in the care of relatives, an act of bewildering desertion that left a permanent scar on the young Robespierre. This double wound, the loss of a mother and the abandonment by a father, would leave an indelible mark on the young Maximilien, fostering perhaps a deep-seated need for order, justice, and control in a world that had, for him, started in chaos. But a brilliant mind, a sharp intellect, was already evident. Robespierre excelled in his local schooling, displaying a prodigious capacity for study and an almost unnerving diligence. His talents did not go unnoticed. At the age of 11, he was awarded a scholarship to the prestigious College Louis Le Grand in Paris. This was a pivotal moment, a passage from the provincial obscurity of Arras to the intellectual heart of Enlightenment France. Here, in the very crucible of burgeoning revolutionary thought, Robespierre immersed himself in classical literature, philosophy, and law. He devoured the works of the great Enlightenment thinkers, Montesquieu, Voltaire, and most crucially Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau's philosophy of the general will, the social contract, and the inherent goodness of man, corrupted by society, resonated deeply with the young student. Robespierre wasn't just reading these ideas, he was internalizing them, forging them into the bedrock of his own moral and political convictions. There's a persistent, perhaps apocryphal, legend that while at Louis Le Grand, Robespierre was chosen to deliver a Latin address to Rousseau himself, who was visiting the college. Whether the encounter truly happened or not, the story perfectly encapsulates the intellectual reverence Robespierre held for the philosopher who would become his ideological lodestar. His time in Paris was a hothouse for his developing mind, cultivating the oratorical skills and rigid moral compass that would define his public life. Upon his return to Arras, armed with a law degree and a searing sense of justice, Robespierre embarked on a legal career that, initially, painted him as a champion of the oppressed. He was appointed a criminal judge in the Diocese of Arras but soon resigned, finding himself unable to impose the death penalty. He famously took on cases defending the downtrodden, the forgotten, arguing passionately for their rights against the entrenched power of the aristocracy and the church. One notable case involved an inventor whose lightning rods were being ordered removed by local authorities. Robespierre, citing scientific progress and individual liberty, won the case. He joined the Academy of Arras, where he wrote essays and poems, arguing for social reforms, greater equality, and the abolition of cruel punishments. His early writings and legal arguments reveal a deeply idealistic man, eloquent and principled, whose early career was marked by a fervent belief in human rights and the pursuit of universal justice. Perhaps most striking of all, the man who would later preside over the execution of thousands, once argued vehemently against the death penalty, calling it barbaric and a violation of human dignity. Arras, however, could not contain the rising tide of his ambition or the surging currents of France's impending revolution. The country was a powder keg. Decades of royal extravagance, crippling debt from foreign wars, and a deeply unequal social structure had pushed the common people to the brink. Famine was widespread. The old order, the Ancien Regime, was teetering. When King Louis XVI, desperate to address France's spiraling financial crisis, announced the convocation of the Estates General for the first time in 175 years, it was a thunderclap that echoed across the nation. This was France's ancient legislative assembly, divided into three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners, known as the Third Estate. It was an opportunity, however slim, for change. Robespierre, recognizing the moment, threw himself into the political fray. He wrote pamphlets, gave speeches, and tirelessly campaigned. Despite his reputation for being somewhat aloof and even awkward in person, his earnestness, his clear articulation of Rousseauan ideals, and his unwavering commitment to the rights of the common people resonated with the electors of Arras. He was elected as one of the representatives for the Third Estate of Artois, taking his seat alongside an assembly that would, in less than a year, declare itself the National Assembly and dismantle the foundations of absolute monarchy. The shy, intense lawyer from Arras was about to step onto the grand, blood-soaked stage of history, armed with an unshakable belief in virtue, reason, and the absolute power of the people's will. He arrived in Versailles, a quiet but determined figure, a voice for those who had been silenced for centuries. The revolution had found its most fervent, and ultimately its most fearsome, champion. By the spring of 1793, the French Revolution, once a beacon of Enlightenment ideals, had descended into a maelstrom of paranoia and bloodshed. King Louis XVI was dead, guillotined in January, a shocking act that sent shivers of both triumph and horror across Europe. But the removal of the monarch had not brought stability. It had merely cleared the stage for a more brutal internecine struggle. At the heart of this unfolding drama stood Maximilien Robespierre, the austere lawyer from Arras, whose star was ascendant within the radical Jacobin club. He was known as the Incorruptible, a man whose unwavering commitment to republican virtue and his seemingly ascetic lifestyle made him an almost messianic figure to the Parisian working classes, the sans-culottes. Yet, this very incorruptibility would become the sharpest blade in his arsenal, used to carve out enemies from within the revolutionary ranks. The National Convention, the governing body of France, was deeply split, dominated by two powerful factions, the radical Montagnards, largely Jacobins, who sat on the highest benches, and their bitter rivals, the Girondins, who occupied the lower seats, often associated with provincial interests and a more moderate stance. The Girondins championed a decentralized republic, wary of the rising power of Paris and its volatile populace. They preached caution, fearing the excesses of the mob and the Jacobin calls for extreme measures to save the revolution. They believed in the rule of law, even for those suspected of counter-revolutionary sympathies, and often clashed with Robespierre's vision of a swift, ruthless justice. Robespierre and the Montagnards, by contrast, believed France was facing an existential threat, both from invading European monarchies and from enemies lurking within its own borders. For them, compromise was treason, and moderation was a luxury the Republic could not afford. Virtue, in their eyes, demanded a single, unified, and utterly ruthless will to protect the revolution. Anyone who disagreed, anyone who hesitated, anyone who voiced dissent, could be branded an enemy. And Robespierre, with his chillingly logical rhetoric, became the chief accuser. He understood the power of fear, the way it could be harnessed to consolidate control, much like a military strategist understands the terrain. The pressure mounted in Paris. Economic hardship gripped the city, bread was scarce, and the endless wars demanded constant sacrifice. The sans-culottes, armed and organized through their sections and the radical Paris Commune, grew increasingly agitated. They saw the Girondins as weak, elitist, and complicit in the nation's suffering. Robespierre, a master of public opinion, expertly fanned these flames. In speech after speech at the Jacobin Club and eventually in the Convention, he painted the Girondins not merely as political opponents, but as conspirators, as agents of the foreign powers, as enemies of the people. They were, he argued, a cancerous growth that had to be excised for the health of the Republic. The atmosphere in the Convention grew toxic. Debates were less about policy and more about survival. On May 26, 1793, Robespierre delivered a pivotal address, declaring, "The people must rise in insurrection against corrupt deputies." This wasn't a suggestion. It was a call to arms, a thinly veiled incitement for the Parisian populace to purge the legislative body itself. The Commune, controlled by Robespierre's allies, responded instantly. On May 31st, an armed insurrection began. Sections of Paris surrounded the Convention, demanding the arrest of the Girondin deputies. The delegates, trapped and terrified, tried to resist, but the sheer force of the mobilized populace, backed by the National Guard, was overwhelming. For 3 agonizing days, the Convention was besieged. On June 2nd, the encirclement was complete. Over 80,000 armed sans-culottes and National Guardsmen stood outside, their cannons trained on the Assembly Hall. Inside, the venerable delegates of the French Republic, men who had once dared to execute a king, were now held hostage by the very people they claimed to represent. The Montagnards, led by figures like Marat and Robespierre, presented a list of 22 prominent Girondin deputies for immediate arrest. When the Convention's president, Hérault de Seychelles, attempted to lead the deputies in a symbolic march out of the hall, they were met by the grim, unyielding wall of armed citizens who ordered them back to their seats. There was no escape. Under the menacing shadow of cannon and bayonet, the Convention succumbed. The motion to arrest the Girondins was passed. The Incorruptible had achieved his aim. His rivals, deemed enemies of the people, were purged from the heart of government. Many Girondins fled, attempting to raise revolts in the provinces, a move that only confirmed Robespierre's accusations of federalist conspiracy and fueled the flames of civil war. Those who remained in Paris were imprisoned, their fates sealed. This brutal consolidation of power marked a chilling turning point. It was a victory not for open debate or democratic process, but for fear, intimidation, and the ruthless elimination of political opposition. It proved that in revolutionary France, the price of dissent could be your liberty, or your life. The guillotine, which had claimed the king, now awaited the revolutionaries themselves. The architects of virtue had begun to build a system where perceived enemies were annihilated, all in the name of the Republic. The stage was now set, not for a period of stability, but for an unprecedented era of state-sponsored terror, with Robespierre standing at its terrifying helm. The air hung heavy with a strange, intoxicating mix of fear and fervent idealism. For Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the Reign of Terror, these seemingly contradictory forces were, in fact, two sides of the same revolutionary coin. His vision for France was a republic of virtue, a society purged of corruption, greed, and all vestiges of the old monarchy. But how, he argued, could virtue triumph in a world still riddled with traitors, internal enemies, and external threats? His chilling answer threw terror. If the spring of popular government in peacetime is virtue, Robespierre famously declared, the springs of popular government in revolution are both virtue and terror, virtue, without which terror is murderous, terror, without which virtue is powerless. For him, terror was not an arbitrary act of cruelty, but a swift, severe, and inflexible form of justice, an indispensable tool to consolidate the revolution and purify the nation. It was the cutting edge of virtue itself, and the instrument through which this terrible virtue was delivered was the guillotine. Before the revolution, executions in France were a brutal, public spectacle designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. Traitors were often drawn and quartered, heretics burned, common criminals hanged. These methods were excruciatingly slow, agonizing, and unevenly applied based on social status. But the Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and humanity, began to question such barbarity. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, a physician and member of the National Assembly, proposed a new, more humane method of execution, one that would be quick, painless, and applied equally to all, regardless of rank. No more prolonged suffering, no more social distinctions in death. The guillotine, with its sleek design and swift, unerring blade, was heralded as a symbol of scientific progress and egalitarian justice. It was meant to be the benevolent face of death. But what began as a symbol of humane justice soon transformed into the relentless engine of terror. Its mechanism was deceptively simple, yet horrifyingly efficient. A tall wooden frame, often 12 to 14 feet high, stood stark against the Parisian sky. At its apex, a heavy, angled blade, sometimes weighing over 90 pounds, was suspended by a rope. The condemned, often with their hands bound, would be led to the platform. They were positioned on a sliding plank, known as the bascule, their neck clamped into a lunette, a wooden yoke designed to hold the head perfectly still and exposed. A quick pull of a lever, a sharp thwack as the rope was released, and the blade plummeted down grooved uprights, severing the head in a fraction of a second. The head would typically drop into a waiting basket, followed swiftly by the body. The entire process, from positioning the victim to the fall of the blade, often took less than a minute. The efficiency was grimly impressive. This mechanical precision was what made it so terrifying. The guillotine didn't discriminate. It reduced king and commoner, general and peasant, man and woman, to the same biological fact. It operated with an impersonal, industrial detachment that removed the human element from execution. Public squares, especially the Place de la Révolution, now Place de la Concorde, became open-air factories of death. Crowds gathered daily, a macabre routine of cheering, jeering, or simply numb observation. The sans-culottes, radical working-class revolutionaries, would jostle for the best view. Knitting women, known as the tricoteuses, sat near the scaffold, calmly counting stitches as heads rolled. Tumbrils, open carts, brought the condemned through the streets, often to the rhythmic chant of revolutionary slogans or the taunts of onlookers. The atmosphere was a bizarre carnival of death, where the ultimate human tragedy became a public spectacle, a morbid form of entertainment, and a stark reminder of the Republic's uncompromising resolve. The sheer volume of executions was staggering. In Paris alone, over 2,600 people were guillotined in just over a year during the height of the Terror, from June 1793 to July 1794. Across France, estimates range much higher, potentially tens of thousands. The guillotine's blade tasted the blood of aristocrats like Marie Antoinette, but also of revolutionary heroes who fell out of favor, like Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins. It was used against ordinary citizens accused of crimes against liberty, such as hoarding food, expressing monarchist sympathies, or even simply for being suspected of suspicion. The criteria for conviction became increasingly vague, and the speed of justice accelerated. Revolutionary tribunals, established to prosecute enemies of the state, often denied the accused the right to legal counsel or the ability to call witnesses. Verdicts were frequently delivered after minimal deliberation, often based on little more than accusation and political expediency. Robespierre's Republic of Virtue demanded absolute purity, and the guillotine was its purger. It was a tool designed not just to kill, but to intimidate, to eliminate dissent, and to enforce ideological conformity. In his mind, every severed head brought France closer to its enlightened ideal, removing another obstacle to true republicanism. The guillotine, once conceived as a humanitarian improvement, became a chilling symbol of a revolution devouring its own, an almost sacred mechanism in the service of a terrifyingly absolute political philosophy. It was the cold, unfeeling steel that embodied the paradox of virtue demanding terror, an innovation designed to be humane, yet remembered as the merciless instrument of mass execution. The blade had swung for thousands, a ravenous maw fed by paranoia, suspicion, and the chilling certainty of Maximilien Robespierre. For months, France had lived under the shadow of the guillotine, a shadow cast longest and darkest by the incorruptible himself. But as the terror reached its fever pitch, a chilling truth began to dawn on those who had helped build it. The revolution, like Saturn, was beginning to devour its own children. And Robespierre, its most zealous father, was next on the menu. The spring and early summer of 1794 saw the Great Terror reach its most brutal extreme. The Law of 22 Prairial, passed in June, effectively removed any semblance of due process. Accused individuals were stripped of legal counsel, witness testimony, and the right to appeal. The only two verdicts available were acquittal or death. The Revolutionary Tribunal, now a mere conveyor belt to the scaffold, sent hundreds to their doom each week. In Paris alone, over 1,300 people were guillotined in just 49 days. The very streets ran red, not with the blood of aristocratic oppressors, but with the blood of commoners, of patriots, of anyone deemed insufficiently pure by Robespierre's exacting, increasingly narrow definition of virtue. Yet, this relentless purification bred not stability, but a creeping, suffocating fear. Every deputy in the National Convention, every member of the Committee of Public Safety, knew that a single misspoken word, a hint of past indiscretion, or merely falling out of favor could earn them a date with Madame Guillotine. Robespierre's power had become absolute, but it was a power built on quicksand, fueled by the very terror it inflicted. He had alienated many, even his former allies. The Dantonists, the Hebridists, all had been purged, their voices silenced, their heads severed. Who would be next? No one felt safe. His increasingly bizarre public pronouncements only exacerbated the fear. Robespierre, a man deeply steeped in the Enlightenment ideals of reason and virtue, believed that France needed a moral, not just a political, revolution. He championed the cult of the Supreme Being, a deistic state religion intended to replace both Catholicism and the atheistic excesses of some revolutionaries. The Fête de l'Être Suprême on June 8, 1794, was supposed to be his triumph. Dressed in a sky-blue coat, he led the procession, burning effigies of atheism and vice. But what was intended as a grand demonstration of unity and moral rebirth instead looked to many like a grotesque display of personal ambition, a cult of personality centered entirely on Robespierre himself. Whispers circulated. Did he see himself as a new prophet, a high priest? His cold, piercing gaze, usually fixed on the concept of abstract virtue, now seemed to hold the power of life and death over every individual in France. For over a month after the festival, Robespierre largely withdrew, attending fewer committee meetings, giving vague, menacing speeches that hinted at further purges of unnamed conspirators. This absence, far from calming the waters, only intensified the paranoia. Every deputy began to imagine themselves on his hit list. The atmosphere in the convention became thick with unspoken dread, a silent countdown to an unknown doom. The tension finally snapped on the 8th of Thermidor, July 26, 1794. Robespierre returned to the convention and delivered a rambling, 3-hour speech. He denounced factions, warned of plots against the Republic, and spoke of purifying the Committee of Public Safety, but once again refused to name the traitors. It was a fatal miscalculation. By keeping his enemies anonymous, he made everyone his enemy. Every deputy in the hall felt the cold breath of the guillotine on their neck. That night, a desperate conspiracy solidified. Men who hated each other, men whose hands were as blood-stained as Robespierre's own, united by one primal instinct, survival. The morning of the 9th of Thermidor arrived, hot and oppressive, charged with a horrifying electricity. As Robespierre tried to speak, he was met with a storm of shouts. "Down with the tyrant! To the guillotine!" Deputies, their faces etched with fear and fury, drowned out his voice. Key figures, like Tallien and Billaud-Varenne, openly denounced him. Attempts to restore order failed. Robespierre, pale and gasping for breath, could only plead, "For the last time, will you allow me to speak?" His voice, that once commanded legions of executioners, was now stifled by the roar of the assembly. A motion for his arrest was passed. The incorruptible, the architect of the terror, was dragged away, alongside his brother Augustin, Saint-Just, Couthon, and Le Biais. The convention, for the first time in over a year, had dared to defy him. But the drama was far from over. The Paris Commune, still loyal to Robespierre, rallied its forces. He and his allies were liberated from their prison cells and took refuge in the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall. For a few frantic hours, it seemed the tables might turn, that Robespierre could yet unleash his loyal National Guard on the convention. But the momentum had shifted. The convention declared Robespierre and his followers outlaws, a chilling decree that meant they could be executed without trial. As night fell, forces loyal to the convention stormed the Hôtel de Ville. In the ensuing chaos, Robespierre was shot in the jaw. Whether it was a suicide attempt or the bullet of a gendarme, the result was the same. The man who had ordered so many executions was now wounded and helpless, his face shattered, his voice silenced. The next morning, the 10th of Thermidor, July 28, 1794, Maximilien Robespierre was brought to the guillotine. He was placed on the cart alongside his closest allies, a grotesque procession through the streets that had once cheered his name. His broken jaw was crudely bandaged, but as the executioner tore it off to prepare him for the blade, he let out a scream, the only sound he would make. A final, guttural cry of a man consumed by the very machine he had perfected. The crowd, a mix of the fearful and the relieved, roared its approval. 23 heads fell that day, but it was Robespierre's that signified the true end of the radical phase of the revolution. The terror had finally devoured its most zealous, and ultimately, its most tragic child. The man who had sought to purify France had, in the end, only purified himself out of existence. Robespierre, the incorruptible, remains one of history's most chilling paradoxes. He was the eloquent champion of universal rights, the man who argued passionately against the death penalty in 1791, only to become the architect of its industrial application just a few years later. His unwavering, almost fanatical, commitment to virtue, to a perfectly rational and moral republic, became the very crucible in which state-sponsored terror was forged. He believed the only way to safeguard the revolution, to purify France, was through the systematic extermination of all perceived enemies, traitors, moderates, even fellow revolutionaries whose zeal wasn't quite pure enough. The guillotine, initially a symbol of enlightened, humane execution, became his instrument of moral cleansing, dispatching thousands in a bloody quest for an unattainable ideal. He sought to create a utopia, but built a charnel house. And so, historians still grapple with the ghost of Robespierre. Was the reign of terror, with its rivers of blood and its mountains of accusations, an abominable but necessary evil? Did France truly face such existential threats, internal and external, that only such radical surgery could save the revolution from collapse? Some argue that without Robespierre's iron will and ruthless efficiency, the nascent republic would have been crushed by foreign monarchies or torn apart by internal dissent. They point to the critical military victories and the stabilization of the economy that coincided with the terror's height. But others condemn it as an unforgivable betrayal of the very ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity it claimed to uphold. They argue that the brutal suppression of dissent, the elimination of due process, and the descent into paranoia created a regime as tyrannical as the monarchy it replaced, perhaps even more so, because it was born from the very aspirations of freedom. A revolution devouring its own children. Robespierre's story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about power, principle, and human nature. When does noble idealism curdle into dangerous fanaticism? How much horror is acceptable in the pursuit of a perfect world? And what happens when a single individual, convinced of their own infallible virtue, gains unchecked authority to define who is an enemy of the people? The next time you hear someone speak of revolution, of necessary sacrifices for a greater good, remember the pale, intense face of Robespierre. Remember the streets of Paris running red. Remember that the path to hell can sometimes be paved with the loftiest intentions. Reflect on the delicate balance between the passion for change and the pragmatism required to build a stable, truly free society. Because the lessons of the terror are not confined to the 18th century. They echo through every movement, every leader, every moment where the promise of utopia is used to justify unimaginable cruelty.